In the early 1900s, Russia was a land of deep problems. The country was ruled by a czar, an emperor with total power. Most people were poor peasants who worked on land they did not own. They lived hard lives with little hope for a better future. The cities were growing, but factory workers faced terrible conditions, low pay, and long hours. On top of this, Russia was fighting in a great war, World War I, which brought immense suffering and death. People were hungry, tired of the war, and angry at the government. They felt that the Tsar did not care about them and was leading the country to ruin. The October Revolution of 1917 was born from this widespread unhappiness. A group of revolutionaries called the Bolsheviks, led by a man named Vladimir Lenin, saw a chance to change Russia forever. They promised the people what they wanted most: peace, land, and bread. They promised to end the war, give land to the peasants, and make sure everyone had enough to eat. This simple message was very powerful. It gave hope to millions of people who had none. They believed that a new kind of society was possible, one where the workers and peasants would be in charge, and everyone would be treated fairly and equally. The revolution was not just about changing leaders. It was about tearing down the old world completely. The Bolsheviks wanted to create a communist state, a place without rich or poor, where all property would be shared by the people. They believed this was the only way to achieve true justice and freedom. For the first time, ordinary people felt that they could control their own destiny. They joined the revolution with great passion, hoping to build a workers' paradise. They imagined a future free from the oppression of the old rulers, where their children could have better lives. This powerful dream fueled their fight against the old system. The hopes were incredibly high, but the challenges were even greater. Russia was a huge and broken country, exhausted by years of war and internal conflict. The revolutionaries had a dream, but turning that dream into reality would be a long and difficult journey. They had to figure out how to run a government, manage the economy, and defend their new state from its enemies, both inside and outside the country. The path they chose would lead to dramatic changes, creating a new nation called the Soviet Union. But it would also come at a terrible human cost, a cost that the hopeful people in 1917 could never have imagined. After the Bolsheviks seized power, Vladimir Lenin became the leader of the new Russia. His first task was to make good on his promises. He quickly signed a treaty to pull Russia out of World War I, bringing a much-needed end to the fighting for his people. He also declared that all land belonged to the state, to be given to the peasants to farm. Factories were taken over by the government and put under the control of workers' councils. These first steps were radical and exciting for many, as they seemed to fulfill the promises of the revolution. Lenin and his party were determined to build the world's first socialist society, and they moved quickly to change everything. However, building this new order was far from easy. Not everyone supported the Bolsheviks. A brutal civil war broke out, lasting for several years. The Bolsheviks' Red Army fought against the White Army, a mix of groups who wanted to restore the old system. The country was torn apart by the fighting, and millions of people died from combat, starvation, and disease. To win the war, Lenin introduced a harsh policy called war communism. The government took grain from the peasants by force to feed the army in the cities. This policy helped the Red Army win the war, but it caused terrible famines and made many peasants turn against the new government. Once the Civil War was over, Lenin realized that the country was in ruins. The economy had collapsed, and people were starving. He understood that the harsh policies of war communism could not continue. So, in 1921, he introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This was a temporary step back from pure communism. It allowed peasants to sell some of their extra crops for a profit and permitted small private businesses to operate. The NEP helped the economy recover and brought some stability back to the country. It showed that Lenin was a practical leader who was willing to adapt his plans to solve real-world problems. During these early years, the structure of the new state was also formed. In 1922, the Soviet Union was officially created, a federation of different republics with Russia as the most powerful member. The Communist Party became the only legal political party, holding all the power in the country. Lenin believed that a strong, centralized party was needed to guide the country towards socialism and protect the revolution from its enemies. He laid the foundation for a one-party state that would control every aspect of life. While he had brought peace and started to rebuild the nation, he had also created a system where all power was in the hands of a small group of leaders. When Lenin died in 1924, a power struggle began within the Communist Party. The man who came out on top was Joseph Stalin. He was a cunning and ruthless politician who slowly pushed his rivals aside. By the late 1920s, Stalin had become the absolute dictator of the Soviet Union. He had a very different vision from Lenin's more flexible approach. Stalin believed that the Soviet Union was weak and surrounded by enemies. He was convinced that the country had to become a mighty industrial power as quickly as possible, no matter the human cost. His rule would transform the nation, but it would do so through fear, control, and incredible brutality. One of Stalin's first major policies was the forced collectivization of agriculture. He ended Lenin's new economic policy and forced millions of peasants to give up their individual farms and join huge, state-controlled collective farms. Many peasants resisted, especially the more prosperous ones known as kulaks. Stalin saw them as enemies of communism and launched a merciless campaign to liquidate the kulaks as a class. Millions were executed, arrested, or sent to labor camps in the frozen lands of Siberia. This violent policy destroyed traditional village life and led to a catastrophic drop in food production, causing a terrible famine in the early 1930s that killed millions of people, especially in Ukraine. At the same time, Stalin began a massive push for rapid industrialization. He introduced a series of 5-year plans which set ambitious goals for building factories, power plants, and mines. The focus was on heavy industry, steel, coal, and iron, to build up the country's military strength. While these plans did succeed in turning the Soviet Union into a major industrial power in a very short time, the success came at a great price. The work was done by people who were treated like cogs in a giant machine. The conditions were dangerous, the hours were long, and the pay was low. The state celebrated its industrial achievements, but the human suffering behind them was immense. The most terrifying part of Stalin's rule was the Great Purge of the 1930s. Driven by extreme paranoia, Stalin saw enemies and traitors everywhere. He launched a campaign of terror to eliminate anyone he suspected of being disloyal. Millions of people, from high-ranking party officials and military leaders to ordinary citizens, writers, and scientists, were arrested by the secret police. They were often forced to confess to crimes they did not commit, and were then executed or sent to the Gulag, a vast network of brutal labor camps. The Great Purge created a society where nobody felt safe. People lived in constant fear that a neighbor, a friend, or even a family member might report them. For ordinary workers and peasants, life in the Soviet Union under Stalin was a mix of hardship, fear, and state-controlled propaganda. The government claimed it was building a paradise for the working class, but the reality was very different. Workers in the new factories faced harsh discipline. Being late for work or failing to meet a production target could be treated as a crime against the state. Housing was scarce in the rapidly growing cities, so many families were crammed into tiny apartments, often sharing kitchens and bathrooms with several other families. Food and basic goods were often in short supply, and people had to stand in long lines for hours to get bread or milk. The peasants, who had once been promised land and freedom, suffered immensely under collectivization. They had lost their land, their animals, and their independence. They were now essentially workers for the state, forced to labor on collective farms for very little pay. The government took a large portion of the harvest, often leaving the peasants with barely enough food to survive. The famines of the 1930s were a direct result of this brutal policy. Those who resisted or complained were branded as enemies of the people and faced severe punishment. The vibrant village culture that had existed for centuries was destroyed, replaced by a system of control and misery. Despite the hardships, the Soviet state tried to control every aspect of people's lives, including their thoughts. Propaganda was everywhere, on posters, in newspapers, on the radio, and in films. It celebrated the achievements of Stalin and the Communist Party, showing happy, heroic workers building a bright socialist future. The education system taught children to be loyal to the state above all else, even above their own families. Arts and culture were also tightly controlled. Writers and artists were forced to create works that glorified the government's policies, a style known as socialist realism. Anyone who dared to create something different was silenced. Yet even in this oppressive atmosphere, people found ways to survive. They relied on their families and close friends for support. They shared what little they had and found moments of joy in simple things. Some people truly believed in the communist dream and worked hard, hoping that their sacrifices would create a better world for their children. Others simply tried to keep their heads down and avoid trouble. Life was a constant struggle, a balance between trying to meet the demands of the state and trying to maintain a small piece of private life. For most ordinary people, the promise of a worker's paradise remained a distant and unreachable dream. The Soviet Union's drive to become a modern industrial nation was, honestly, one of its central goals. Leaders like Stalin believed that, without a powerful industrial base, the country simply could not defend itself or compete with the capitalist nations of the West. The 5-year plans were, designed to achieve this transformation at an incredible speed. The government poured all of the country's resources into building massive industrial projects, steel mills, tractor factories, and hydroelectric dams. On paper, the results were, impressive. The Soviet Union went from being a mostly agricultural country to one of the world's leading industrial powers in just a couple of decades. But this rapid growth, however, created immense problems. The central planning system, where the government in Moscow made all the economic decisions, was actually very inefficient. Planners set unrealistic targets, and factory managers were under extreme pressure to meet them. This often led to them cutting corners, producing low-quality goods, or even lying about their production numbers. The focus was always on quantity over quality. While the country could produce a lot of steel and tanks, it struggled to produce enough consumer goods like shoes, clothing, and household items. This meant that, while the state grew stronger, the people's standard of living remained very low. The human cost of this industrialization was, frankly, staggering. The giant projects were often built by forced labor. Millions of prisoners from the Gulag camps were used as a disposable workforce in the harshest conditions, digging canals or mining in the freezing cold of Siberia. Many of them died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and abuse. Free workers were not treated much better. They were subjected to strict labor laws and constant pressure to work harder and faster. The state promoted a culture of shock workers, who were celebrated for exceeding their production quotas, putting even more pressure on everyone else. The new industrial cities were often bleak, polluted, and lacked basic services. The system also had a devastating impact on the environment. The push for industrial growth at any cost meant that there was no concern for pollution or the long-term health of the land. Rivers were contaminated with industrial waste, forests were cut down, and entire regions were poisoned by chemical plants. The Aral Sea, once one of the world's largest lakes, began to shrink dramatically because the rivers that fed it were diverted to irrigate cotton fields. These environmental disasters would create long-lasting problems for the people living in those areas. The Soviet Union did succeed in building its industrial might, but, it did so by sacrificing the well-being of its people and the health of its planet. By the 1980s, it was pretty clear that the Soviet Union was in deep trouble. The economy was stagnating, and the system of central planning, which had once driven industrial growth, was now hopelessly inefficient. The country was spending huge amounts of money on its military to keep up with the United States in the Cold War, but it just could not provide its people with basic goods. Factories were outdated, and productivity was falling. On top of that, the long and costly war in Afghanistan was draining resources, and honestly, morale. The Soviet people were growing tired of the empty promises and the gap between the government's propaganda and the reality of their daily lives. In 1985, a new younger leader named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He recognized that the country simply could not go on like this. He believed that the system needed to be reformed, not replaced. So he introduced two major new policies. The first was perestroika, which meant restructuring. This was an attempt to reform the economy by allowing some small private businesses and giving more freedom to state-owned factories. The goal was to make the economy more efficient and productive. Gorbachev hoped that these changes would breathe new life into the socialist system and improve people's lives. The second policy was glasnost, which meant openness. Gorbachev believed that for economic reforms to work, there needed to be more freedom of speech and information. He allowed newspapers and television to criticize the government and discuss problems that had been forbidden for decades. The dark history of Stalin's rule, the corruption in the Communist Party, and the country's economic failures were all brought out into the open. This was a shocking change for a society that had lived under strict censorship for so long. For the first time, people could speak their minds without fear, and a vibrant political debate began to emerge. However, Gorbachev's reforms had some, unintended consequences. Instead of strengthening the Soviet system, they ended up weakening it. Glasnost allowed people to voice their deep unhappiness with the system, and criticism quickly grew. It also unleashed powerful feelings of nationalism in the different republics of the Soviet Union, such as Lithuania, Georgia, and Ukraine. People in these republics began to demand more autonomy, and some started calling for complete independence. At the same time, perestroika failed to fix the economy. The reforms were too slow and inconsistent, and they ended up causing more chaos, leading to shortages and inflation. The old system was breaking down, but a new one was not yet in place. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, which were meant to save the Soviet Union, instead accelerated its collapse. The policy of Glasnost opened the floodgates of information and dissent. People learned the full truth about the crimes of the past, like the secret pacts with Nazi Germany and the massacres ordered by Stalin. This knowledge destroyed what little faith was left in the Communist Party. At the same time, nationalist movements grew stronger in the 15 republics that made up the USSR. From the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to the Caucasus and Central Asia, people began to demand the right to rule themselves. They no longer wanted to be controlled by Moscow. The power of the central government in Moscow was slipping away. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept across Eastern Europe, and the communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany fell one by one. The Berlin Wall, which had been a powerful symbol of the Cold War division, was torn down. The Soviet Union, weakened by its own internal problems, did not intervene to stop these changes. This sent a clear signal to the republics within the USSR that Moscow was losing its grip. If Eastern Europe could break free, why couldn't they? The desire for independence became an unstoppable force. The final blow came in August 1991. A group of hardline communist leaders, who were afraid of Gorbachev's reforms and the country's disintegration, attempted a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and tried to seize power to restore the old authoritarian system. But the people of Russia, led by the newly elected president of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, resisted. Thousands gathered in Moscow to defy the tanks and protest the coup. After just 3 days, the coup collapsed. It was a major turning point. The failed coup destroyed the authority of the Communist Party and showed that it no longer had the power to control the country. After the failed coup, the end came swiftly. One by one, the Soviet republics declared their independence. Boris Yeltsin emerged as the most powerful leader, and he moved to dismantle the Central Soviet government. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and signed an agreement that officially dissolved the Soviet Union. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The red Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. After nearly 70 years, the great communist experiment was over, and the world was left to wonder what would come next. The breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 created 15 new independent countries and threw the entire region into a period of deep crisis. Russia, the largest of the new nations, faced enormous challenges. Under its first president, Boris Yeltsin, the country attempted a rapid and honestly pretty painful transition from communism to a free market economy. This shock therapy involved suddenly ending government price controls and selling off state-owned industries. The result was economic chaos. Prices skyrocketed, wiping out the life savings of millions of people. Production collapsed, and unemployment soared. A deep social and economic divide appeared in society. This turbulent period of the 1990s was a time of great hardship for most Russians, while a small group of well-connected individuals, who became known as oligarchs, became incredibly wealthy by buying up the nation's valuable assets like oil and gas companies for very low prices. the majority of the population fell into poverty. The government was weak, and crime and corruption were widespread. The sense of national pride was shattered, and many people felt humiliated by the loss of their country's superpower status. This difficult decade also saw a brutal war in Chechnya, a region in southern Russia that tried to break away, which further highlighted the government's weakness and instability. The other 14 new countries that emerged from the Soviet Union also faced their own unique struggles. Some, like the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were able to reorient themselves toward Western Europe and successfully build democratic and market-based societies. Others, particularly in Central Asia and the Caucasus, struggled with poverty, political instability, and authoritarian rulers who were often former communist leaders. Ethnic tensions that had been suppressed under Soviet rule often flared up into violent conflicts. Each new nation had to build its own government, create a new economy, and find its place in the world. The collapse of the Soviet Union dramatically changed the global balance of power. The Cold War, which had defined international politics for nearly half a century, was over. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower. For the new countries, especially Russia, the 1990s were a time of troubles that left deep scars. The economic pain and political instability of that decade created a strong desire for order and stability. This desire would eventually pave the way for the rise of a new leader, Vladimir Putin, who promised to restore Russia's strength and national pride at the beginning of the new millennium. The story of the Soviet Union, from its revolutionary birth to its quiet collapse, offers powerful lessons that are still relevant today. One of the clearest lessons is about the danger of sacrificing human freedom for a political idea. The Bolsheviks started with a noble goal to create a fair and equal society for the working class. But in their quest to build this paradise, they created a totalitarian state that controlled every aspect of life. The system crushed individual liberty, freedom of thought, and human rights. The history of the gulags, the purges, and the famines shows that when a government has total power, it can lead to unimaginable suffering. Another important lesson comes from the Soviet economy. The experiment with a centrally planned economy showed that such a system is ultimately unsustainable. While it was able to achieve rapid industrialization in the early years, it did so at a terrible human and environmental cost. Over time, the lack of competition, innovation, and personal incentive led to stagnation and inefficiency. The system could produce tanks and rockets, but it could not provide its people with a decent quality of life. The Soviet collapse demonstrates that an economy cannot thrive without adapting to change and responding to the needs and desires of its people. The breakup of the USSR also teaches us about the power of nationalism. The Soviet Union was a multinational empire, held together by the force of the Communist Party. For decades, it tried to suppress the unique identities of the many different ethnic groups within its borders. But the policy of Glasnost showed that these national feelings had not disappeared. They had only been hidden. Once people were given the freedom to express themselves, the desire for national self-determination proved to be a more powerful force than the ideology of communism. It reminds us that people's connection to their own culture, language, and history is a fundamental part of their identity. Finally, the Soviet Union's history is a cautionary tale about the difficulty of changing a rigid and authoritarian system. Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts at reform revealed that a system built on control and fear cannot easily be opened up. Once the government loosened its grip, the forces it had suppressed for so long were unleashed with an energy that could not be contained. The story shows that political systems, like people, must be able to adapt and evolve. The Soviet Union fell because its leaders, for too long, refused to face the truth about its deep problems. Its rise and fall will forever stand as a powerful reminder of the complex relationship between ideals, power, and the enduring human spirit.